This lecture is the second in our series from Chapter 11, and the topic today is Green Revolution and Modern Agriculture. First, let's begin with a look at subsistence agriculture, which is the traditional type of agriculture that has been practiced worldwide for about 10,000 years. Subsistence agriculture relies on small farms with human labor primarily, although animals are occasionally used to help in the process. You can see the picture there on the right that shows a man using two cows to pull a plow through a field. Now, subsistence agriculture is a historic method of farming, and it's still used in developing countries. These small family farms only grow enough food to feed themselves, plus in a good year they'll have a little bit extra that they can sell or trade for other products that they aren't able to make themselves. Their planting decisions are based primarily on what their family needs to eat. That means they're not going to be doing a lot of cash crops like coffee. They're going to be producing things like wheat, corn, rice, vegetables, fruits, whatever their family is going to rely on. And in subsistence agriculture, there's a limited use of fertilizers or pesticides or even machines. Now, this brings us to the topic of energy subsidy. Energy subsidy is something that it's a term that we use to describe how much energy needs to be put in to the farming process in order to get 1 calorie of energy out of the farming process. So, in other words, this is the number of calories required to produce food for each calorie of energy received. This means that our choices about what we eat are also energy choices. Now, if you take a look at the graph on the right-hand side there, you can see that for something like small-scale corn, move my mouse over there, so for something like small-scale corn, we're looking at an energy subsidy of 0.2. That means that if you have a small-scale farmer, he's going to expend about 0.2 calories of energy for every 1 calorie of energy he receives. So this is a good investment. He's actually producing more energy than he uses. Now, if we move up the scale, we'll see that large-scale corn, the energy subsidy is about 0.5. Small-scale eggs is around 0.75. Coastal fishing, we get about 1 calorie of energy out for every 1 calorie we put in. It's an even trade. Now, as you move up the scale here, notice that large-scale egg farming, we end up not breaking even on this. Grass-fed beef, actually, we are putting out about 3 calories of energy for every 1 that we get back. Now, the typical U.S. diet in 1950, we were spending about 5 calories of energy, and this could be energy as in terms of fossil fuels, natural gas, oil, things like that. We were spending in 1950 about 5 calories of energy for every 1 that we consumed. And move up to 2010, we're spending about 10 calories of energy for every 1 that we consume. Now, this is really inefficient, and that's one of the things that we want to keep in mind as we're thinking about the way that we do farming in the world. Now, the Green Revolution, which we're going to learn about next, has increased our energy subsidy in the developed world. It's greatly increased the amount of energy we have to put in to our crops in order to get 1 calorie of energy out. So, quiz question for you, true or false? The energy subsidy of modern agriculture is much lower than that of subsistence farming or hunter-gatherer societies. Now, is this A, true, or B, false? Go ahead and choose your answer. And the correct answer is false. The energy subsidy of modern agriculture is actually much higher than that of subsistence farming or hunter-gatherer societies. We expend a lot more energy today to create 1 calorie of food than we ever have in the past. Now, this brings us to the Green Revolution, which was not so green if you're thinking about sustainability or environmental friendliness. However, the Green Revolution did produce a lot of green, both meaning money, and green crops for food. So the Green Revolution occurred from about the 1950s to 1970s in developed nations, and it was a process of scientific advancements in agriculture that led to increased crop yields by about 200%. That means our crop yields just about doubled in that time. And we were able to increase the acreage that we were farming by about 25%. Now, a key player in all of this is a gentleman named Norman Borlaug. He was a scientist who bred different strains of wheat and crossbred them until he was able to develop a disease-resistant strain of wheat, which allowed him to win the Nobel Peace Prize. He also made several other key advances in agriculture during that time. He and quite a few other scientists, actually. Now, we've had a second green revolution lately that has lasted from 1967 to the present. This involves using more genetically engineered crops, many of which are designed for developing countries. These would be things like dwarf wheat or dwarf corn. They're crops that grow a much shorter stalk, and they're very sturdy, so they can stand up to a lot of wind. And they're able to grow larger heads of corn and bigger stalks of wheat on that the same short stalk, and that means that the plant is actually putting more energy towards producing the food, the fruit, the part that humans want, and less energy producing the rest of the stalk. So the second green revolution is ongoing, and we've had a lot of advancements in that area. We'll talk about genetically modified crops later. So some of the things that the green revolution has led to. It has actually produced an entire system of farming that they refer to in Food Inc. as agribusiness. It's a series of large-scale farms and farming corporations that really control a lot of the way that food is produced and marketed in our world, especially in Western society. So one of the first things that results of green revolution, which has led to modern agribusiness, is mechanization. Mechanization is when you have machines that replace manual labor. Now, in a country like the United States, where labor is so expensive, mechanization makes quite a lot of sense. It's economically efficient, but it's not necessarily better than manual labor in terms of the quality of the product that you get out. A lot of times human hands can actually do things better, it's just that they cost a lot more. So the results that we have from mechanization, there are two main things. First of all, mechanization means that large farms are going to be more efficient than small farms. It doesn't pay to spend $100,000 on a combine machine if you're only farming 10 acres of land. You're never going to make back your investment. But if you're farming 1,000 acres of land, that large combine is going to get a lot of work. And that's a picture of a combine there at the bottom, harvesting I think corn, but I'm not positive. Another result of mechanization is that we end up with monocultures, which are more efficient than polycultures. So monoculture we'll talk about later is when you have a single crop being grown on an area of land. Polyculture would be multiple crops. Now, the use of machines to do the harvesting means that those machines are going to do much better if they just get all of one kind of thing. They don't have to distinguish between the corn and the soybeans, or the corn and the wheat, or whatever. Now, a second result of the Green Revolution and characteristic of modern agribusiness is the use of irrigation. So irrigation is when you actually water an area of land. Maybe the water either comes from the groundwater or it might be pumped over from a local river or stream using pipes or canals. Now, irrigation increases productivity. You can see there in the picture there are certain crops, circles that are being heavily irrigated. You can tell how dark green they are. Others that may be nearing harvest or may not be irrigated as much, those are in yellow, and then these are areas that are not irrigated at all. They're not being used for agriculture. This is a picture taken from Oregon, so you can clearly see the effect of irrigation on the landscape. Now, irrigation makes arid land, like semi-desert or desert land, arable, meaning farmable. An example of this is the Imperial Valley, which is right here in Southern California. The Imperial Valley actually is a desert, but because of all of the water that we ship into that region, they're able to grow fruits and vegetables there. Now, some of the problems with irrigation, we may end up depleting the groundwater resource beneath us. And we saw an example of that in the Ogallala Aquifer in the Midwest, where the aquifer is shrinking and the water table is dropping, means that it's making it much less accessible for farmers there. We also may have saltwater intrusion as a result in coastal areas, because as we deplete the groundwater, that leaves a little bit of a vacuum, and salt water from the ocean is drawn into that space. Finally, the soil can become degraded with excessive irrigation through the process of waterlogging or salinization. And we'll talk more about those later, but in a nutshell, waterlogging is when the soil becomes repeatedly saturated with water and can't drain. It means that the air spaces in the soil are filled up with water, and there's a lot of plants that can't actually live in that environment. And then salinization is when you have an area that's repeatedly watered and then the water evaporates. So that as the water evaporates, it leaves salt behind, and that salt can inhibit growth of plants. So that's irrigation in a nutshell for you. Quick quiz question. The drawbacks to intensive irrigation include all of the following except waterlogging, salinization, depletion of aquifers, saltwater intrusion, or decreased productivity. So which of the following is not a drawback to intensive irrigation? Go ahead and take a look at the list, choose your answer, and if you haven't picked it yet, go ahead and pause. The correct answer is E, decreased productivity. So all of the other things we do see with intensive irrigation, the waterlogging, salinization, depletion of aquifers, and saltwater intrusion, however, productivity increases with irrigation. So E is the correct answer in this case. Now, another aspect of the Green Revolution and another characteristic we see now in modern agribusiness or modern agriculture is the use of fertilizers. Fertilizers are intended to replace the depleted nutrients and the organic material in the soil. So the nutrients would be nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Now there are two main types of fertilizers. The first one is organic. Organic fertilizers come from organic matter, which would be decomposed plants or animals. It can be animal manure or it can be compost. And the benefit to organic fertilizers is that they contain nutrients and organic material. So that means not only are we getting the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the NPK that we need, the organic material helps improve the soil structure. So we have soil that is better at water holding, so it has a higher water holding capacity, it drains well, and there's plenty of organic material to provide air spaces for the roots. Now, synthetic fertilizers are also known as inorganic fertilizers. These are produced commercially and they require lots of energy. They're very concentrated fertilizers. These synthetic fertilizers are just the nutrients. There's no organic material involved. And the application of synthetic fertilizers can lead to runoff into waterways, which can then lead to eutrophication. Now, if you remember, eutrophication is a big word that means good food. The only problem is it's good food in the short term, but in the long term it leads to fish kills and the depletion of dissolved oxygen in the water. So as the nutrients like the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium enter the waterway, the nutrient level goes up, the algae feed off of those nutrients and they bloom, and then when the algae all die, they run out of nutrients and they die, then the bacteria move in, decompose the bodies of the algae, and in the process of decomposition they do respiration, cellular respiration, so they consume all of the oxygen from the water, which lowers the oxygen level so much that fish and other animals that live in that waterway end up dying as a result. So a couple of problems with synthetic fertilizers, we end up with runoff, which can lead to eutrophication. Synthetic fertilizers also don't add the organic material, which helps improve soil structure. So quiz question for you. Synthetic fertilizers are preferred by many large-scale farmers because, and there are three choices here that you're going to have to choose between. One, they provide the correct amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium and can be adjusted to meet the needs of each plant. Two, they replenish the organic material lost from the soil. And three, they can be applied to crops easily using methods like crop dusting. Now, your choices are 1 only, 2 only, 3 only, 1 and 2, or 1 and 3. This is a typical multiple choice problem from the AP. They like to give you 3 options that you then decide between, and then your answer, your actual answer, is stating which of those 3 options are correct. So in this case, pause if you don't have the answer yet. The correct answer is E, 1 and 3. So synthetic fertilizers are preferred by large-scale farmers because they provide the correct amounts of NPK and can be adjusted to meet the needs of each crop. That's number 1. And then also number 3, they can be applied to crops easily using methods like crop dusting. Number 2 is incorrect because synthetic fertilizers do not replenish the organic material lost from the soil. All right, a couple more aspects of the Green Revolution that have held on and been continued into modern agriculture. The next one is monocropping. We discussed this briefly. Monocropping is when you grow one crop in a field at a time. So we end up in the United States with fields of more than 1,000 acres of all one crop. And the benefit to monocropping is that we end up with improved efficiency. Improved efficiency means that we have higher crop yields per acre, which means that each acre of land is producing more food. Now, some of the drawbacks to monocropping. First of all, we end up with high levels of soil erosion because when you do monocropping, you're exposing huge areas of land all at once. And all of that exposed soil can then be subject to wind erosion, which can reduce the productivity of that area of land. Secondly, monocropping leads to a high vulnerability to pests, which means that you have to use more pesticides to keep those pest populations in control. Think about the difference between, let's say you've got a friend whose favorite food is Oreos, and he's faced with a dessert table that is full of, 100 different kinds of cookies. He's got to really search to find the Oreos in there. Versus having a table where the entire table is nothing but Oreos. Your friend is going to have a much easier time finding what he's looking for on the table with only Oreos, rather than having to sort through hundreds of different types of cookies. So monocropping is the same way. When we're presenting our pests with an entire field and acres and acres and acres of exactly what they want, versus polycropping, which is when you mix up the species and intermingle them on one piece of land. We'll talk more about polycropping in another lecture. All right, the last aspect of the Green Revolution would be pesticides, increased use of pesticides. So pesticides can be either natural or synthetic, means they can be either naturally occurring, harvested from plants that grow in nature, or they can be synthetic, meaning that we developed them in chemical laboratories. They kill organisms considered to be pests, and we have several types. Herbicides kill plants, insecticides kill insects, rodenticides kill rodents. So you should be able to tell from there that suffix CIDE, side, means kill. If you're talking about humans, we're talking about homicide, patricide, genocide. Those are all different other words that also mean kill. So for pesticides, pesticides kill pests. We have two different types. There are broad-spectrum pesticides, which kill a wide range of pests. And then we also have narrow-spectrum pesticides, or selective target pesticides, and selective pesticides, which target a narrow range of organisms. So we may have broad-spectrum pesticides that will kill all insects. We may also have selective pesticides that will kill only, cockroaches, for example. Now, the goal with pesticides is to prevent crop damage, because by preventing crop damage, we increase our crop yields, which means that we produce more food per acre. Some of the problems we have with pesticides, though, there are definitely some drawbacks. First of all, persistent pesticides remain in the environment for a long time, like years. DDT is an example of this. DDT, we found, can last in the environment at least 50 years, and it gets stored in the fatty tissue of organisms. Now, persistent pesticides lead to something we call bioaccumulation, means that the concentration of those pesticides in an organism's tissue increases over its lifespan. So when it's very young, it may not have very many pesticides stored in its tissue, but by the time it has led a full life and dies, the pesticide level in that organism's tissue is going to be much higher. Now, we also have non-persistent pesticides. These break down in weeks to months, which is better. That means that they have fewer long-term effects on the environment, which is a good thing. However, they must be applied much more frequently in order to be effective, which is not so good. So we do still see environmental impacts of non-persistent pesticides simply because we have to keep applying them to the fields so frequently. Finally, we have this issue with pesticides called resistance. Resistance is the survival of the fittest. Basically, pests that survive the pesticide one time can pass their genetic resistance on to their offspring. And this leads us into something we call the pesticide treadmill. It means that we have to continually increase our application of pesticides to combat this increasing resistance in pests. So here's a picture here of the pesticide treadmill. Let's start over on this side here where it says develop a new pesticide. So that new pesticide gets developed, we apply it to the field, and most of the pests die, but there are still some that are resistant and they survive. Those resistant organisms, whatever their genetic makeup is, they aren't killed by this pesticide. They pass their resistance on to their offspring, and so the proportion of resistant individuals continues to grow as the pest population grows. So that means the next time the farmer applies his pesticide, there's going to be less of a result and less of an effect. So that means not as many of the pests are going to be killed off. So the end result is that we have a crop that's infested with pests, so we go on and develop a new pesticide, and the cycle begins again. I'm sorry for the quality of this picture, but the graph was worth showing you. So this is a picture of what the pest population looks like over the course of one pesticide being used. So this was a pesticide called pyrethroid, which is targeting tobacco budworms, and takes place in the 1980s. So what you see here is that the percent survival of this tobacco budworm is graphed as we go. So here's the growth of the organisms, then there's the first application, and the population is reduced. Then the organisms recover, come back, and there's a second application the next year, 3 times actually, May, July, and September, and then the population is reduced. And then May, July, September again, we end up reducing the population, and then finally in the end the population has climbed even more. So each time that the pesticide is applied, we get less and less of a result. And this is the problem with the pesticide treadmill. So let's close our lecture with 2 more quiz questions. First of all, the environmental consequences of using pesticides include which of the following? Is it A, bioaccumulation in fatty tissue, B, runoff into local waterways, C, groundwater contamination, D, unintentional destruction of desirable organisms, or E, all of the above? So go ahead and think through that list and think about what the environmental consequences of using pesticides might be. If you don't know your answer yet, go ahead and pause it, because the correct answer is all of the above. We see all of these things happen with using pesticides. So please make sure that you are familiar with these so that you can understand and effectively describe some of the consequences of pesticides in your exams and in your future. It's good to know how the things that we do affect the world around us. All right, and last quiz question. All of the following are components of modern agribusiness except A, monocropping, B, increased pesticide use, C, decreased irrigation, D, mechanization of processes, or E, increased use of fertilizers. So look over that list. One of them is not correct, all the rest are. All the rest are representative of modern agribusiness. And if you don't know the answer yet, go ahead and pause it, because our correct answer is decreased irrigation. One of the things that we see with modern agriculture is that we actually increase our use of irrigation significantly. So all of these are the five main ways that agriculture has changed from subsistence agriculture to modern agriculture. And what we're going to be looking at later on in the chapter is ways that we now have a movement of sustainable agriculture that are trying to reverse the environmental damage caused by these 5 processes. So moving from monocropping to polycropping, decreasing our pesticide use, finding ways to irrigate with more efficiency, The process is still fairly mechanized. I don't know that we're trying to reverse that one too much. And then also decreasing our use of synthetic fertilizers and increasing our use of organic fertilizers like manure or compost. So I hope you guys have enjoyed the lecture. This is 2 of 5 or 6. The rest of them will be posted in the next couple days, so please keep on studying, and I will see you all in class.